Magic the Gathering is one of the biggest trading card games in the world. It was originally released in 1993, so if you're a new player, or you're someone who's never played a trading card game, how do you get started? Wizards of the Coast, the makers of Magic, have recently released the Game Night 2022 pack. It's $50 and it's a way to attract new players as well as provide fun to veterans. So let's break it down and see if the Game Night 2022 is a good way of teaching new players. I'm Caprinic Tutor and I'll be your guide to Game Night 2022. So the first thing you'll see after opening the box is a small guidebook. This does a really good job of kind of giving basic instructions on how to play, things like turn order and all that kind of stuff. It also does a really good job of describing a little bit about each deck, and it gives kind of a full deck list of each deck. After the guidebook, you'll have a sheet of different cardboard cutouts. These are going to be life platforms as well as +1/+1 counters. These just help you keep track of things like your life total as well as the power and toughness of various creatures on the battlefield while you're playing the game. After we get through the counters, we have our 5 spin down dice. These are how you keep track of your life total during the game. You'll notice that unlike a traditional D20, they go kind of in order, so you have 20, 19, 18, 17 instead of randomized like a normal D20. Each one is color coded to the deck that they go to, which I thought was a really nice touch. Finally, we'll get to the actual decks that are inside of the box. There's 5 in total, representing each of the 5 different colors that are in Magic. One thing you might have noticed is that each deck has a card that basically gives you the stats of the deck, so like speed, creature amount, stuff like that. These are kind of nice for new players because they give an idea of how the deck is built, but it really isn't that important for which deck to choose. Underneath the stat cards of each deck, you'll see there's 3 double-sided tokens. These can be important during gameplay because certain creatures and certain cards will summon tokens, which come from outside of play, then you put them on the field, and then they represent creatures that you can either attack or block with. So the tokens are good. I do like that they have tokens that account for every single type of token that can be generated from the 5 decks. I don't like that they don't have a way to track more than 15 tokens though. So one common thing in Magic, especially when you're doing like a 5-way free-for-all, is if you have decks that generate a lot of tokens, you're probably going to get past that 15 mark pretty quickly. I would have loved to see Wizards include a D6 or 2 of each color, just so people can track tokens a little easier. This is a very common thing that people do in Magic, so I don't think it would have been complicated to ask new players to adjust to extra die. This might seem a bit out of order, but now I want to touch on the other side of those stat blocks that have the names of the decks as well as their stats, and that's going to be the turn order card. I think it was brilliant to include one of these for each deck when it comes to the perspective of someone brand new to trading card games, because Magic has a relatively complicated turn order and it's really easy to forget what steps come when and how to play it out. So I think having a card that new players can just have next to them at all times so they remember the kind of flow of the turn is a good addition overall. Now let's take a closer look at the 5 decks in the box. Our first deck we're going to cover is the green deck, which is called Boundless Elves, and it's headed by Imrel Elfheim Elite. It has the key cards of Llanowar Elves, Elvish Archdruid, and Overrun, and it also does pretty much exactly what it says. It summons a bunch of elves, a lot of them will buff each other, and it'll also summon a bunch of elf tokens. I like that they decided to go with an elf deck here because elf decks do a really good job of showcasing a lot of the different things that green decks are really good at. Things like Llanowar Elves, which gives you more mana. You also have stuff like Elvish Archdruid, which buffs all of your elves. And then even the mythic card that comes in here, Imril, works by getting additional buffs based on how many elves you have. So overall, the synergy of this deck is really good. It also does a really good job of introducing players into the kind of things that a green deck will do. On top of that, a lot of the instants and sorceries in this deck work really well with that game plan of overrunning your opponent and winning the game through sheer numbers. My major gripe with this deck is a lot of the keywords like Death Touch and Reach on cards like Thornweld Archer have no description of what they do. So if you're a new player, you're not going to know what these do, and you're going to have to go to the guidebook to read what they do, which could break gameplay and just make the game take longer. Our next deck is going to be the white deck called Glorious Combat. This deck is headed by Zamriel, Seraph of Steel, and it has the key cards of Swords to Plowshares, Heavenly Blademaster, and Sword of Vengeance. This deck focuses heavily on equipment and creatures who get additional bonuses from being equipped. One good example of how this works is the key card Sword of Vengeance. Sword of Vengeance gives a creature +2/+0, First Strike, Vigilance, Trample, and Haste. It sounds like a lot, and quite frankly, it is a lot. But if you equip it to a creature like Kitesail Apprentice, it gets an additional +1/+1 and flying from its own effect. So suddenly your 1-mana creature is a really big threat for all your opponents. To add to this, you also have Zamriel's special effect, which makes all of your equipped creatures indestructible on your turn. That just means it's a lot safer to attack your opponents whenever you get the chance to. Similarly to how the elf deck works, this does have a lot of synergies and it does show off a lot of the basic things that white decks do. I don't think it's as strong as the green deck in that regard, but I do think it's a really good way to introduce players into a different play style they might not have considered. Now let's move on to the red deck. This deck is called Draconic Fury and it's led by Nagi, Draco Zealot. It has the key cards of Lightning Bolt, Flame Blast Dragon, and Crucible of Fire. And if you kind of know what red decks do, you know we're about to break a lot of stuff. This deck does a good job of showing off some of the things that red decks are known for, like dealing direct damage to target creatures or opponents. It is a bit slow because it relies heavily on the dragons in the deck, but I don't think that that's a knock against it because it does have a lot of cards that synergize well. Just like the first two decks, this deck also encourages you to get your mythic on the field as quickly as possible. Nagi gives the effect of reducing the cost of all of your dragons by 1, and this pairs extremely well with the Dragon Speaker Shaman, which does the exact same thing, but it's 2 instead of 1, so you can end up getting dragons that cost 3 less. So instead of spending 5 mana for a dragon, you're going to spend 2. I might get some hate for saying this, but I do appreciate that for the red deck, the theme is pretty simple and it's just throw everything at your opponent and be as aggressive as possible. Overall, I think Wizards did a good job of picking themes that made sense for each deck, and they feel very well constructed and well balanced against each other. Our next deck on the list is going to be the blue deck. This deck is called Political Trickery, and it's headed by Maeve, Insidious Singer. The key cards are Counterspell, Murmuring Mystic, and Plea for Power. This is arguably the most complicated of the decks in the set, since blue has a lot of strategies involving delaying your opponent or countering their spells. One thing that I think sets this deck apart from the other 4 is that it includes a lot of different things like the keyword Goad on a lot of its cards, which require you to have multiple opponents to really get their full effect. Like every other deck, you're also encouraged to get your mythic out early if you can, and Maeve's effect revolves completely around Goad. Now you can have Maeve target one of your own creatures with her effect, which will then cause one of your creatures to attack your opponent. In a 2v2 this works, but I don't think that it's very new player friendly, especially because Goad is a little bit complicated of a mechanic anyway. By no means do I think this deck is bad, I just think it's not the most new player friendly, and it's definitely designed for more of that free-for-all feel, less of the 1v1 you might be doing. Our final deck in the pack is going to be called Dark Sacrifice. This is the black deck and it's headed by Vogar, Necropolis Tyrant. It has the key cards of Sign in Blood, Demon of Loathing, and Zombify. Personally, I would have liked to see more zombies in this deck, as it is a grave deck. It has a lot of vampires and demons, which don't always work super well in a grave deck, but they don't feel out of place and the deck does feel pretty well balanced. A good example of a combo you can do in this deck is Vogar and Reassembling Skeleton. Vogar has the effect of whenever any creature that you control dies, it gets a +1/+1. Reassembling Skeleton has the effect of being able to be pulled out of your grave for just 2 mana. Because of this, you can use Reassembling Skeleton to pump up Vogar multiple times in a turn if you have the mana to do so. Vogar also has the added benefit of when it dies, you get to draw cards based on the number of 1/1 counters on it. I like this because even your main card in the deck that it's kind of built around you're encouraged to let it die if it needs to, because there are ways to get it back on the field and there's also benefits to letting it die. Overall, I think it's a good deck, it's well made, and it balances with all the rest. So now that we know what MTG Game Night 2022 is, we want to ask the question, is it worth it for players who've never played a TCG before? Let's go ahead and look at the pros first. All decks are monocolor and they each have a specific theme, which makes it very easy for new players to pick them up. The on your turn cards help a lot with new players as well, so they can always keep track of where they are in their turn and not get confused. The 5 spin downs and the tokens that go with each deck are also a nice little touch, though I have a few gripes with whether or not they should have included a couple of other ways to track things like tokens. The guidebook is very well written and the instructions are extremely clear. The decks also only have basic lands in them, which is another plus, because things like fetch lands and shock lands can get a little bit confusing and just make the game take longer. Finally, there's very clear descriptions of how the stack works inside the guidebook, which I think is very important, especially for new players, because the stack can get very confusing. As you can see, there's a lot of positives and even a bunch that I didn't mention in this section because I covered them when I was reviewing the decks. Now let's look at the cons from the perspective of a new player. Startup can take a while given the amount of instructions. The playbook is about 30 pages long, and it's not completely clear on some of the ways that various different spells or creatures interact with each other, or even how certain keywords might affect other different effects in-game. Keywords are also not fully described on the creature cards they appear on. Some decks don't have a single creature that describes what a keyword they have do, even though a lot of creatures in that deck will have that keyword. The instructions don't really describe very many of the different combos that are in each deck, which can just make it harder for new players who've never played a trading card game to pick up on the various combos the deck they're playing with can do. So, is Magic the Gathering Game Night 2022 worth it? Is it a good place for new players to start the game if they've never played before? My personal opinion, I don't think it's perfect, but I think it is a pretty decent starting point. It's a fun way to just pick up and play Magic without having to build decks and worry about buying expensive cards. New players will have to look back and forth between the instruction manual quite a bit, which isn't the best, and experienced players might not get a lot of excitement out of it, but overall, I'd give it a 7 out of 10. Thank you all for watching. I'm Caprinic Tutor, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.